At UFC 287, Jorge Masvidal will be facing off against Gilbert Burns. This is going to be an amazing fight, and I'm so excited for this matchup. Now, Masvidal, he's currently on a bit of a skid lately. He's dropped his last 3 fights. Of course, he didn't lose to low-ranked opponents. Those losses came at the hands of Colby Covington. Colby absolutely dominated Jorge from pillar to post from the very start of this contest. But Jorge definitely made a good account of himself. The other 2 losses that he had came at the hands of the former welterweight champion Kamaru Usman. Both of those fights were really, sort of one-sided there. It wasn't really competitive in either of those. Of course, Jorge made a good account of himself, but at the end of the day, it really wasn't as competitive as what Jorge would have hoped himself. It's incredibly well known that Jorge Masvidal, he does tend to struggle against people that are very good grapplers, especially grapplers that are at this particular level that grew up with it as their base and as their strongest form of martial art. He really does struggle to sort of get a rhythm going and stopping that dominant grappling, which sort of shuts down his striking quite a bit. Now, all this leads up to obviously his next opponent being Gilbert Burns. Now, Gilbert Burns, what an exciting fighter this guy is. Now, like Masvidal, he's getting on in age as well. Both these guys aren't exactly spring chickens in the world of mixed martial arts, and the durability of both of these guys is definitely going to come into question here. With Gilbert, it doesn't really seem like he's declining much at all to me. Maybe you guys have a different opinion, where Jorge seems to sort of, be stagnant, improving a little bit, but definitely not at the rate of Gilbert, in my opinion. Now, Gilbert Burns' last fight, he is coming off a quick first-round submission against Neil Magny, which was quite impressive. That fight took place at UFC 283. I certainly wasn't expecting a first-round submission. And before that fight, he did come off second best against the rising star Khamzat Chimaev, who is taking the welterweight and middleweight divisions by storm. That guy's an absolute freak, and Gilbert Burns arguably could have won that fight or did win that fight. So with Gilbert Burns, I do actually believe that he does have another run left in him. He's obviously still showing some great improvements within his game of mixed martial arts, and I do tend to think it's going to be a tough matchup for Jorge. So let's just compare the fighter statistics now, and let's just have a look at some stats of some both men here. So Jorge Masvidal, he's getting on in age. Obviously, Gilbert Burns is no spring chicken either. Jorge Masvidal is currently 38 years of age, whereas Gilbert Burns is currently 36 years of age. There's not a huge age difference within these two, but there is a big discrepancy within their overall skills within mixed martial arts and their overall competencies as a mixed martial artist. They obviously have both different strengths in different areas, but there is a 2-year age gap. I think Jorge's age has started to show a little bit more than Gilbert Burns. I think Gilbert's durability has obviously dropped off just a little bit, but he hasn't shown really much of a decline. It hasn't been as noticed as much with me, considering that he's improved as a martial artist alongside that. So the durability hasn't really become noticeable as yet. Where I think Jorge Masvidal, he's been in quite some wars there, and obviously he never really quits in his fights, but I think his durability is going to be a little bit more. He's going to be a little bit more vulnerable to punishment than what Gilbert Burns currently is. Jorge Masvidal, he does come into the fight with a 1-inch height advantage, and both of these fighters' records, Jorge's 35-16, so he has suffered quite a few losses. With Jorge, I don't think he's suffered a career knockout apart from Kamaru Usman, which was only a couple of years ago. Before that, he never really gets knocked out, so that just goes into what I show and went over earlier, that Jorge Masvidal, he just doesn't have an ounce of quit in him, and you can be sure even if he does lose the fight, he's going to come out and give it everything that he's got, and he's going to be hard to beat for any man. Whereas Gilbert Burns' record is a lot more impressive. He comes in at 21-5. When he first came into the UFC, he was getting a lot more submissions, but towards the tail end of his career, you've seen a lot more of a variety of wins, where they're a win from knockout, decision, and submission. And his 5 losses... His only 5 losses are really against high-level opponents, former champions, and obviously the rising star, which was Khamzat Chimaev, who is going to be taking welterweight by storm. We don't really know if he's going to make his home at welterweight or middleweight. I think long-term middleweight. Obviously, the weight on the night will be 77.1 kilograms for both of these guys. I believe both of them did compete at lightweight at one point, so I don't think there's either athlete is going to have a size advantage. Where I think it's going to be good for Jorge in this fight is, as you can see here, his reach is 188 centimeters, whereas Gilbert Burns is 180 centimeters. So I think it'll be crucial for Jorge here to utilize his advantages in range and his superior striking to Gilbert to try and get a win here in this matchup. So with Jorge Masvidal, after his most recent loss to Colby Covington, he did say after the fight that he's going to dedicate the rest of his career to really focusing on his wrestling and his grappling, because he's a smart enough fighter to recognize himself that is the weakness in his game, and that's sort of where he comes a bit unstuck. His defense isn't overall that terrible when it comes to grappling and wrestling. Obviously, he's at a pretty high level himself. But when you're facing people like Kobe Covington, Kamaru Usman, and obviously Gilbert Burns, who have very, very high level grappling as it being their base, he does struggle a bit and it causes him to get quite tired. And he does have trouble at times getting to his feet, having to exert a lot more energy than a lot of other people at this weight class. Obviously, after his last fight, how he did recognize this weakness. If he has been working on it like he said, how much of a difference that's going to make within this fight. Because if he can keep the fight to his feet and stop Gilbert Burns there, it's going to make the fight a lot more interesting. Now, with Gilbert Burns, he has one of the best jiu-jitsu games in the UFC. He's probably one of the better jiu-jitsu grapplers within the UFC. I think an advantage for Jorge Masvidal here is Gilbert Burns is going to be a lot better on the ground than what you would say a Kobe Covington and Kamaru Usman would be as his overall grappling game. But he is going to have a harder time taking George down than someone like Kobe Covington Kamaru Usman did. So I think that's going to work in George's favor here. If he's a little bit harder to get to the ground, it's going to make it a little bit harder for Gilbert Burns to implement the style of game that he wants, that he's going to be able to dominate Jorge. Obviously, Gilbert Burns is no slouch of a striker either, and his takedowns are very, very good for a jiu-jitsu athlete. Us jiu-jitsu athletes, we tend to focus a lot on the ground, and the takedown aspect of the game tends to lack a little bit. So I believe Gilbert Burns, he's clearly worked on that, and his takedowns are fantastic, but that is an aspect of Gilbert Burns' grappling game that's going to work in Jorge's favor, because Gilbert can't take the fight to the ground. Obviously, Jorge Masvidal is a better striker than Gilbert Burns, in my opinion. I don't know, let me know what you guys think. That's where I think Jorge Masvidal is going to win this fight. He has to keep the fight standing, which I don't think is any secret to anyone. Obviously, he did fantastic against Ben Askren. People would say that was a lucky knee. It wasn't luck, it was planned, but all the stars aligned, and he did mean that knee. But also, it would have been interesting to see how that fight would have played out if Ben got a hold of him, being the high-level grappler that he is as well. So it's an interesting fight. Jorge must win this fight. I think this is his last chance at getting a UFC title before his career ends. I wouldn't even be surprised if Jorge decided to retire after this fight. I mean, I don't know what else is left for him after this fight if he doesn't get the win. At the very least, he has to make it extremely competitive in a very close fight and show real improvements within his game, because if he loses this fight and doesn't really show anything here, the UFC is going to be very reluctant, even regardless of how popular Jorge is, to be giving him another title shot. I don't see it happening, to be honest. And Jorge's a legend within the sport. Obviously with his backyard brawls back in the day when he didn't have a pot to piss in. But I think this is really it for him. Whereas Gilbert Burns, on the other hand, he's looking to be a serious contender and have a last run at this welterweight strat. I think he can do it too. I think within this fight, guys, Gilbert Burns is going to show, unfortunately for Jorge, that he is levels above what Jorge is. And I don't like saying that because I'm a fan of both fighters and I love watching them fight. But I just believe Gilbert Burns is going to be too strong overall. When you look at the picture of mixed martial arts, I think it's going to be a lot for George to handle, to be honest. I don't know if he's going to be able to deal with it. In fact, I'm betting on the fact that he won't be able to deal with it. And I think Gilbert Burns will take this most likely within 3 rounds. And I'm going to tip him to get a submission here. He did say, Gilbert Burns, that he was going to utilize his grappling skills a lot more often. He's a great jiu-jitsu athlete. And he recognized that he's going to use a lot of these strengths after his last win against Neil Magny. So I think that Gilbert's going to try and put on a clinic here and show everyone his dominant jiu-jitsu grappling and put Jorge away. But what do you guys think? I'm very excited for this card regardless. Let me know in the comment section below, and I'll see you guys next time. Thanks very much for tuning in. I'll see you later.